Hello and welcome to another edition of The Final, a look back on the Champions League finals of the past. Last time we looked at the 92-93 season where we had Marseille versus Milan. We are lucky enough to talk about Capello's fantastic Milan side tonight. We are looking at the 93-94 European Cup and UEFA Champions League season with a focus on the final with two of the biggest teams in European football. Speaking of big teams, we've got a couple of big names. We've got the boss, Phil Harrison, Mr. Fuzzball Geeks. Hi, Phil. How are you doing?
You're too kind, Rob. Yeah, thank you. I'm very well, thank you, guys. I hope the listeners have had a great New Year. I hope you guys have had a great New Year. Welcome to the show. There's a lot to get through. It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, definitely. Plenty of stories within that all the way to the final. We've also got Alex Ireland, author of Pretty Polly, the history of the football shirt. If you haven't bought it yet, please go out there and get it. So Alex can buy himself some more football shirts. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm all right. Or it wasn't until I looked and I saw United timidly exiting the European Cup in the autumn, which seemed kind of like eerily familiar for this season.
Alex is one of those closeted United fans who was in everybody's faces in the 1990s and early 90s, but slowly dwindled into the fence. I like that Homer Simpson meme of him sliding back into the green grass. Maybe he'll do that this season as well. Right, we're going to get right stuck into it. So a little bit of a preamble. We aren't at full UEFA Champions League stage as yet. 94-95 was the first season where it was a full UEFA Champions League competition. We are still in the realms of kind of this weird hybrid mode, and we might talk a little bit about that. And we did it in the last episode as well. So we are at UEFA Champions League status for the group stage in the semi-finals, but we are in the European Cup stage for the preliminary rounds and for the final. Or if you want to be really precise, we are in the European Champion Clubs Cup, whichever you prefer. But we are in the realm of champions taking part in the tournament. None of this second, third, fourth place nonsense that all these modern football teams like to do. But we are in the realm of champions. Phil, these preliminary rounds, we've had a few additions for the first time being involved with this tournament. We haven't got any teams from Yugoslavia, but we do have some other teams from Croatia, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and Wales entering. There's a few interesting stories in that preliminary round, particularly one involving Dinamo Tbilisi and Linfield. Can you shed any light on that for us?
I can indeed, mate. I mean, Dinamo Tbilisi had this kind of heritage of being this fantastic footballing kind of artisan team of the 70s and early 80s. Of course, they knocked Liverpool out the European Cup in 1979 and went on to win the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1980-81, and they blitzed West Ham at Upton Park on the way to that final. Every Hammers fan talks about it. But they won the Georgian League the previous season, as you correctly said. It was the first time a Georgian team after the kind of the fall of the Soviet Union had competed at this level. And Linfield played against them in the first round, and I think they drew 1-1 in Northern Ireland, and then they took it to the Boris Pashadze in Georgia, and the Georgians won 2-1. So Dinamo Tbilisi, they qualified. They were in the bag for this for the first round, but it transpired that the Turkish referee who officiated on the game then reported them to UEFA. They'd offered him gifts prior to kickoff. So after a UEFA inquiry, they were summarily dumped out of the competition, and Linfield progressed by default. So that was the story of the preliminary round, the big story of the prelim.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because if you're going to try and bribe a referee, you've at least got to try and make it count like Marseille did and actually win something from it. But at least the Turkish referee had the decency to turn down the bribe. But what an incredible story for a team like the size of Linfield to be getting through that preliminary round and into the first round proper. Alex, when you look at Champions League qualification now, or any European qualification, I suppose, in modern football, it's still kind of that sort of minnows versus some major teams in the landscape. But there's certainly something to be said about this preliminary round just featuring champions rather than champions of what we now call those lower leagues, mixed in with some of the bigger European teams who might have finished second, third, and fourth. Are we getting to a point where there's an argument that this is probably a more effective system of it, or is that gulf just too big now?
I know what you mean. It's nice, this idea, isn't it? When you look through the list to see champions and just this plethora of different nations represented. Whereas, as you say, now they would be weeded out in the, probably by the end of July. But things like in that preliminary round, there's a British Irish, Cumbrian against Cork City. You just said Linfield get through. That two teams that aren't from England and Scotland out the British and Irish Isles getting through. That's unheard of, isn't it? It's just nice to see some different faces going through. I think like we had also an Icelandic team, had a Maltese team going through. Again, these are teams that if you're watching in August are already, they're on the belated summer holidays.
I suppose we're at the point in this season, especially where we're in that hybrid zone of just the European champions, clearly moving towards that Champions League model. Berlusconi talked about it through the back end of the 80s and the early 90s with Bernard Tapie about having a form of a European Super League. And I suppose these preliminary rounds are one of the first things to disappear, weren't they, Phil? And when we get into the first round, this is where we start to see the big teams arrive, the big champions arrive. And everybody who's in the competition is actually in this round, isn't it? In the first round, like we said before, we're not in this phased area. We're not in this area where we've got pots with people getting picked out and they can only play certain teams. You're a champion. If you got through the preliminaries, the first round is your zone, isn't it? So
that's it, mate. And the big boys were all there. I mean, the guys who were semi-finalists in everything other than the name the previous season. Rangers were there, and their expectation was that they would cruise past Bulgarian champions Levski Sofia, but it never quite happened that way. They won 3-2 at home in the first leg, and then a last-minute rocket by Nikolai Todorov, virtually last kick of the game into the roof of the net, and they're out. So the guys who almost made the final the year before, they're out. Man U were in there as well. They made it through. They were played against Kispest Honved, and they qualified for the second round. More about them later. And then we had the two finalists themselves, who had very narrow squeaks getting through the first round. First, we had Barcelona, who lost away 3-1 in Kiev against Dynamo Kiev, and reversed that in the Nou Camp, winning 4-1, just about. So they went through by a narrow margin. And then Milan squeaked through against Arrow of Denmark, 1-0 on aggregate. Jean-Pierre Papin's striking. Oh, no, not Denmark, Switzerland, sorry. Jean-Pierre Papin's strike just about doing the job for the Rossoneri. So you can see that it's a kind of minefield for big clubs, the first round, with some exiting and some only just making it through to the second round. And again, that's where some fun happened as well.
Yeah, and when you look through the list of some of the scorers in this, Alex, as two men of a certain age who were youths around this time, playing a lot of Championship Manager as it was, and Phil, obviously you were a youth at the time playing Championship Manager as well, Phil. We will include you with that.
Just about, mate. Just about. Yeah.
Only just hitting your teens, Phil, weren't you, in the 90s?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We'll stick with that one. We'll stick with that one.
But Alex, we can see some of the names starting to come through that were probably names that we would sort of identify with as time goes on. Goran Vlahovic scoring for Croatia Zagreb, for just being one of them. You've got the young Roy Keane getting goals for United. Oyvind Leonardson finding the back of the net for Rosenborg as well. You look down the list of some of these goal scorers, and although there's still a bit of mystique around European football, it was quite a time where the East especially was on the rise, but there's still some superstars. That element of balance, I suppose, with the star players being spread across different European teams is something that's quite amazing to see in this tournament, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's so sad, isn't it, really, that isn't the case, that teams don't have the maturity now where they can be at a big club until in a smaller league until 23, 24, 25. I mean, I think, was it Shevchenko maybe moved at 23 to Milan and had 3 or 4 really good quality Champions League campaigns. And really, that was a fantastic story, and nobody would have wanted to have taken him out of that team. And as you were saying, Kiev had Rebrov scoring in this round, who obviously would stay there until 26, 27. But yeah, lots of names popping up in their national teams. I think Vladimir Bischasnik, who would go on to play in Spain. There's Turkelmaz from Galatasaray. And I can't remember. I think he was maybe second or third top scorer. There was a guy, a New Zealand striker, a guy called Winton Rufer, who played in briefly in England, but generally in Switzerland, and had a very successful period in Werder. But I don't think he kind of really came across the public consciousness unless you were into the Bundesliga. But he was a really good striker, and yeah, bagged in 3 goals in this first round.
Luke Nillis is one that I always look at as being sort of one of those players like you say, Alex, who stayed at a club for a little bit longer because they could stay in the tournament. So Nillis at Anderlecht before he went to PSV, played up front with Ronaldo. He scored a hat-trick in one of these games. But he was the kind of player, he could stay at his club because they would be in the, UEFA Cup or European Cup quite a lot. And
sorry, just one thing that we'll talk about related to that is obviously the foreigners rule in Champions League, which didn't include for the home nations, Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. So, but I think that really limited it. That now you might have 8 or 9 players from a different nationality in your team, whereas in that case there are a limited number of spots really for foreign players, and so that's probably contributed to them. You wouldn't have taken a risk on a 21-year-old to sit on your academy where you could flip him for a profit. You would have to be signing somebody who was an absolute guaranteed first choice, because those were really precious spots, those 3 foreigner places.
I remember writing about that in the 92 book, actually, The Birth of Modern Football. And it was interesting that there was such panic because UEFA hadn't really thought it through in terms of the teams that would have Scottish players, Welsh players, players from Northern Ireland within their teams. And I think that it does change that sort of talent pool, doesn't it? And I do think that maybe in the next 10, 15 years, possibly that we do start to see a little shift, because it can't go on funneling that talent towards the top. And I think if you're looking at this is 30 years ago, isn't it, actually, this season? How different that is, and it really does affect the lineups, especially in the final. Alex, I'm going to stay with you because I did follow United a little bit back in the time, because you always follow the team that wins. Honved were a team that you'd never heard of before, but you'd heard of because they played Man United. And Galatasaray was something that's very similar too. Obviously, English teams have been out of Europe for the back end of the 80s into the early 90s. I know United won the Cup Winners' Cup. The European Cup was still kind of somewhere that we probably weren't competing. I suppose as a young United, I mean, you probably look at it maybe differently now, but as a young United fan, playing a team like Galatasaray, drawing with them 3-3 at home and then going away to hell, as the Galatasaray fans put it. What was it like, I suppose, thinking about that as a fan, being in the European Cup and playing a team that you kind of probably didn't know that much about?
I think it's exciting that there would inevitably be a couple of names on the team sheet you did recognise, and actually you probably wouldn't have that encyclopedic knowledge of football, so it's probably somebody you've seen in a World Cup and has caught your eye, and then you realise you're facing off against them at club level. So it was always exciting, I think. And I suppose moving off a bit, as that got later and perhaps people's knowledge became greater, and you had like Borussia Dortmund or Monaco appearing, and there were maybe 4, 5, 6 players that you recognise well. It's sort of a real treat being able to see them in the flesh. And I think going on, even as a 10 or 11-year-old, what really characterised Manchester United was this kind of naivety that from 85 to 90, obviously we hadn't been in Europe, and that really seemed to show that we had really good players, Cantona, later Keane, Kanchelskis, Bruce Pallister, etc. But there is a different mode of playing in Europe, and it was this kind of thud and blunder Premier League style that just didn't translate to European football could be so easily picked apart. And you sort of see it in the Galatasaray game. You know, you go ahead, score a couple of goals quite early, but get picked off very easily by just naivety, and saw it later on with the Barcelona game in future seasons. But I think even as a 10 or 11-year-old, he had this nervousness that we could be out of a game as quickly as we could get into it.
Especially because you were dominating so much, I suppose, from 92, 93 and made such a good start to 93, 94. But Phil, those teams were on a bit of a different level. You know, even though Galatasaray may, you know, no disrespect to Galatasaray, were probably not one of the favourites for the tournament. You know, they were probably looking to get as far as they could. But other teams within that second round that we're into now.
Yeah. So
now you've got Barcelona, Milan. It's given a slightly different feel, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and they both comfortably got out of this group. Barcelona thrashed Austria Vienna, and I think Milan beat Copenhagen, who Linfield had been ousted by in the previous round. Linfield, who qualified after the Dynamo Tbilisi debacle, but Milan won 6-0 in Copenhagen in the first leg, and it was over then. So they were both comfortably through to the group stages, and there were two great groups, but two very different groups. Group A was one that was absolutely dominated by Barcelona. They won that group comfortably, unbeaten, and they did the double over their closest rivals, who were Monaco, and I think they blitzed Spartak Moscow 5-1, and beat Man U's victors Galatasaray 3-0 at home. And a very prevalent figure in their kind of on their score sheet was Ronald Koeman, who was, of course, a kind of a big, bustling, very talented centre half, and he would finish the top scorer in the Champions League that season. I think we talked about him before. It's 7 of his goals were directly from free kicks in that. But just an incredibly talented guy who obviously English fans have a lot of affection for after what happened in the World Cup qualifier in 1993.
I love that he's a big pantomime villain, isn't he, Ronald Koeman? He's almost got like the weapon as well. Like, you know, like have you seen those soccer slammers, wrestlers that they make where they do like a footballer's? He'd have like a thunderbolt leg or something, wouldn't he? Just smashing the ball in from all kinds. But he was incredible. That dead ball, Phil, unbelievable, isn't it?
It was like, yeah, and I remember there was a player called Hotshot Hamish, who was a cartoon kind of footballer in the 1970s, for all those old enough to remember him. But he reminded me of Koeman because he had these huge kind of thighs, and he could just smash a ball in from an incredible range, which we'll probably revisit when we move into the semi-final stage, because in the semi-finals he scored an incredible goal, the one goal that wasn't direct from a free kick. So yeah, they absolutely cruised it through their group stage, and it transpired that they would become the top scorers in the tournament that season. 23 goals in their game. So you know they were pinging them in from all angles.
Koeman does seem a man out of place, though, doesn't he, in that Barcelona team? You know, it's the dream team. He's this big sort of burly sort of pub football type looking player who's absolutely incredible on the ball, can pick a pass out. And I suppose, Alex, we're quite used to seeing, you know, the Pep Guardiola false 9 and the 3-4-3 and the fullbacks invert and all this kind of stuff. But Cruyff had built that at Barcelona before Guardiola got there as a manager, but obviously had Guardiola at the heart of his team, sort of the heartbeat of his team. Building that team and winning 3 consecutive titles before this one, it is one of the greatest teams in European football, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got this nice splash of a few. The kind of the Cantera is represented by like Sergi and Guardiola and Ferrer, but then you've got these absolute blockbuster international players. You know, Romario was incredible, and Stoichkov, etc. Laudrup we'll talk about later. But yeah, it's nice balance of the best Barcelona teams, isn't it? That they've got that kind of homegrown core, and then it's accentuated by these really, you know, effectively a selection of the best players from around the world.
I think as well, with Barcelona, certainly from my point of view, I remember watching any of their Champions League games. It didn't feel like normal football because the noise in the new camp wasn't anything like you would see on Match of the Day, or we had the big match on ITV, or even cup games. Those atmospheres fill in the Champions League, and I hate the whole. It's a special European night at Ground X or whatever. Obviously, it's a special night. It's European football. It's a special thing, isn't it? But seeing Barcelona, especially when they were blitzing teams, the noise, it was like sort of a carnal atmosphere, wasn't it? Kind of really sort of euphoric through a lot of their games.
It was, mate, and they say that crowds can give you a 1-0 lead before you start, but with Barcelona, it seemed like they could give you a 3-0 lead because they were absolutely annihilating teams, and not only in Barca, also in Milan. When you watch the games, like it was a different kind of noise, wasn't it? And that's what made it so exciting. In Milan, it was kind of a noise, but it seemed muted in a way. It had this odd quality to it, but as soon as the home fans' tails were up, there was this upsurgence in noise that kind of that came through your TV set. Basically, you could actually hear it.
Yeah, I always think Spanish football's got that raw sort of euphoric element to it, whereas the Italian game's got that sort of sway and the kind of noise builds, and then it is let go. And that Milan team, I suppose for a lot of the fans, Alex, they probably weren't kind of feeling a lot of euphoria, although they were quite dominant in the league. It's quite a famous one, and you hear it on any kind of clickbaity type football social media account. Can you believe Maldini and Baresi played 7,000 games together and only let in 12 goals, or all those stupid stats that people come out with. But if you do look at the 93-94 league table, it's in Serie A, obviously. It is crazy, isn't it? The goals they scored and still won a title. I suppose it just shows the type of. I suppose Catenaccio was back, wasn't it, for Capello in this season, compared to Saki's sort of high pressing 4-4-2 powered by the three Dutch players.
Yeah, and you've just got so many impressive players in that core, and like you say, the players who've played together, kind of, likes of Costa Curta, Maldini, Baresi, Tassotti, as a unit, and kind of know each other well, and they're very well screened as well. Desi, we'll talk about him being absolutely imperious in running the final, but him, Albertini, you've got a solid core, solid keeper, solid midfield, and then you've got this kind of like little sparkle of stardust with likes of Boban, Savicevic, Papan, and Laudrup, and it's a team as well that might have a few more goals if it hadn't been. This was the point at which Van Basten's career sort of disappeared and injuries got the better of him. So I've no doubt the goals for column would have looked a lot healthier without him on the treatment table.
Yeah, Daniele Massaro certainly did a lot of heavy lifting in that sense, and he was kind of, often a secondary striker, maybe linking up the players. Sometimes he'd play out wide. I remember him a little bit from USA 94, which is obviously was after this. But the way they built their squad, Berlusconi didn't really care about the 3-4 rule, did he? And I think he was almost sort of a precursor for what we've got now with just hoarding talent, like you say, Boban, Savicevic, Brian Laudrup, who's on loan from a relegated Fiorentina. Who was your pick of the bunch, Alex? If you were watching football or you were playing it or whatever, or even now, who's your pick out of that Milan squad?
As a left back, I could only pick Maldini, but that's biased. It's very difficult, but I think Boban, Savicevic, both excellent. I would pay to watch either of them. I mean, Desi in a different way, particularly at that phase. I think particularly Premier League fans who got to know him at Chelsea, sort of playing further back in central defence, and really had lost that ability to absolutely dominate a midfield, which he had, and probably people have maybe a false perception or memory of him as a classy centre back, whereas he was much more than that. So Maldini personally, and then probably one of those three in the midfield and forwards.
It's probably too hard to pick, isn't it, Phil, out with that squad? But if you're signing someone in 1993 from Milan, who's that one standout you'd take?
Well, we spoke about this in the previous show, and it's always for me. It was Roberto Donadoni, just such an incredible live. I mean, in the final, we'll get to the final, but he absolutely tore shreds off Sergei Barjuan during that final. And he assisted in one of the goals, but was also integral in a lot of the play that kind of destroyed Barcelona on the evening of that game. So he has always been a Milan favourite for me. Not just a Milan favourite, just a favourite, because he was just incredibly gifted on the ball, reticent of although he came afterwards, like JJ Okachiri, just do incredible magic things that you wouldn't have thought were possible. So yeah, he was a real favourite for me, mate.
Yeah, I first started playing Championship Manager in this season. They had an Italian edition that came out in 93, 94. So it was either Milan or Bari that were my team, because Bari had Igor Protti, who scored loads of goals. But I remember trying to work out which foreign player to pick for Milan, and Brian Laudrup never ever got picked in my side, unfortunately for him. But he does feel like the oddity for me. But in terms of the players, Boban was always the one for me. Just like from a midfield point of view, he was just phenomenal on the ball and quite an incredible player. But looking around that side, I mean, you could pick anyone to probably build a team around, but Capello had certainly built his defence first. I mean, Italian football had always had a reputation at that time for being a defensive league, which wasn't always true. They just knew how to defend, which is different to being defensive. Whereas English football, a lot of the football was still, quite a way behind where other nations were. I looked at some stats beforehand, so I don't mind doing that every time to time. And Milan average 1.05 goals per game in Serie A, which is quite incredible to then win the league. I mean, normally, you're looking at what, 70, 80, 90 goals in a 38-game season for a title winner in the Premier League, maybe. But if you look at the European Cup, they average 1.75 goals per game. They almost doubled what they were doing in the league, which I think is quite incredible. Or maybe it shows how strong Serie A was at the time, because, Juventus were a good side, Sampdoria, Lazio, Parma. There wasn't that much separating a lot of those top teams, but Milan, I think, was still sort of top of the tree. So we've looked a little bit at the...
Another thing, sorry, Rob, if we contrast, it's a good contrast with Barcelona, because they scored over 90 goals that season, which kind of gives you a really good insight into their relative approaches.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. And, I was going to bring into that as well, when we looked at sort of the road to the final, looking at how the teams were playing in their league. So if you look at Barcelona, I mean, I think, if I remember rightly, they'd won 3 consecutive league titles. I'm sure that one of them was on goal difference and 2 of them had been last game deciders. And I think, again, 93, 94 was another one, wasn't it, Phil? Last game decider.
Oh, I love these stories. I mean, they won the 2 trophies. It wasn't going into the last game. Real Madrid were top of the league on the last game.
That's right.
3 points ahead of Barcelona both times, and on both occasions they went to Tenerife and lost 3-2 that one time, lost 2-0 the other time, which handed the trophy to Barcelona. And the same thing happened this season with the Deportivo La Coruña.
That's the one. Yeah.
They were firing for their first ever Spanish title, and they were at home to Valencia on the last day of the season. And all they needed to do was win by any kind of scoreline imaginable. And they got a penalty in the last minute of the game. And it was a Serbian centre up. I think his name was Dukic.
Yeah.
And if you watch it, it was an awful penalty, virtually straight down the keeper's neck. And he saved it, and Barca did their half of the bargain. They won. And again, they won the league on the last day of the season. So we talk about Barcelona dominance in their league, and yes, they won trophies back to back, 4 seasons on the bounce. But there was always an element of fortune attached to those wins.
And they won back end of the season. They won 13 out of the last 15 games, starting with an 8-1 win against Osasuna. And then you look at it again, they beat Real Madrid. That was probably the game that probably got them to win the title, was the 7th of May when they went to the Bernabeu and won 1-0. Whereas if you contrast that with Milan, because obviously as we're thinking about the build-up to the final, Milan didn't win any of their last 6 games. They had 2 defeats and 4 draws. So, I mean, they dominated the league all the way through, and I think they'd only lost 1 before that point in the first 28 games, whatever it was. And they lost a couple near the end. But going into that final, I mean, even in the group stage, Milan, they beat Porto by a point to stay top of the group. Obviously, that could have been the other way around, and it could have been a Milan-Barcelona semi-final, which would have been very interesting for Porto and Monaco. But as it turns out, they got through it. They won the group, and then there was 2 single-game semi-finals. Now, again, we've said before, the format was in a little bit of flux. UEFA, as they do, were toying around with it a little bit. So after the previous season, if you remember, 91-92, they'd started with group stages where the group winners had gone into the final. And then 93-94, you've got group winners going into semi-finals. Phil, the semi-finals, I'm not going to say they were dead rubber, because obviously they're tough opponents, Monaco, and they got to the semi-final, and the same with Porto as well. But to be brutally honest, both sides came out 3-0 winners, and it wasn't a massive challenge for them. Yes, they've got to play well. Yes, they've still got to get through. But winning 3-0 against decent teams in a semi-final of a European Cup is pretty comprehensive, really, isn't it?
It was a huge class divide in both games. I mean, Monaco came with a view to try and stop Milan, but I mean, the anticipation was that it was going to be a narrow Milan win, because in the league they'd won 9 of their league games 1-0, and they'd drawn 8 of their league games 0-0. So they weren't going to concede many goals. But it was thought that Milan would progress, and I think they had Costa Curta sent off in the first half as well. So they were, I think they were 1-0 up at that stage, but it was 1-0. Costa Curta was off. They were down to 10 men, and they still went on in the second half and advanced comfortably. I think there's a Albertini strike, a fizz banger from outside the box by Albertini, and then there was a half volley by Massaro, who we mentioned before, and they were through to the final. And then in the other final, Barcelona did a similar job on Porto, scoring a couple of early goals to go 2-0 ahead, and then Koeman, who we've mentioned, who ended the season as top scorer, scored possibly his finest goal out of the 8 that he scored, and there were some good ones amongst them. But this was from open play. He picked up a crossfield pass inside his own half, and he advanced about 10 yards, and then just hit it. It was just hit it, and it flew into the top corner of the net, and they were through safely 3-0 as well. So they were very one-sided semi-finals, but they did set up the final that everybody wanted, and it was a story of 2 very different teams, and pundits had very different ideas about who was going to be dominant in that final.
Yeah, definitely, and I think obviously we sort of alluded to that with the form at the back end of the league season. Milan pretty much knew they had the league title sewn up, so we're kind of putting all their energies really into the Champions League. And Barcelona knew they wanted to win that 4th title in a row. But on the sort of single game semi-finals, Alex, I do wonder if a little bit of jeopardy. I know there's a lot of money at stake, and 2-legged games it's supposed to give a bit of balance, and it's supposed to mean that teams can play in front of their home fans and all that kind of stuff. But there's something quite exciting about a single game semi-final, isn't there? Getting straight to a Champions League final. Yeah,
I mean, I like that in the COVID season, the idea of this sort of jeopardy. I mean, it's slightly tempered by the fact that the 2 were at home, the group winners played at home. So slight remove of that. But yeah, European ties in the closing stage at neutral grounds, that would be a pretty good sell, wouldn't it?
Don't give you away for any ideas, or we'll be at the Dallas Cowboys 115,000 seat stadium watching whoever it is in the Champions League final, maybe. So maybe we won't make that one public, that suggestion. All right, so we've got, both teams have won the league. So they've finished their league seasons. Milan was quite early, 1st of May. A couple of weeks later was Barcelona. So both league champions by the time they get to the final, which was on the 18th of May. So that was at the Olympic Stadium in Athens. Referee by an Englishman as well, nonetheless, Philip Don, who was probably the first referee I feel like everybody learnt the name of, possibly because he was on the Champions League, but, you know, he kind of had that Philip Don name. It sounded like it could be some kind of gangster. But we've got a full house. We've got Milan. We've got Barcelona. And I'm going to go through the teams. I always think it's quite interesting to look at teams, and especially in this case, because in the final, obviously the 3-foreigner rule was in play. Milan, I mean, if social media was around now, you know, the fan accounts and the press would be talking about Milan can't possibly win. They've got too many players out. Van Basten's career's it's over at this point. Lentini is injured. Baresi's suspended. Costa Curtis suspended. 3 non-nationals allowed. So you've got Florian Radicchio, you've got Jean-Pierre Papin, Brian Laudrup, all out. Cruyff has got his own Laudrup. He just doesn't pick. Capello went on record to say, I was worried about Michael Laudrup and how we'd deal with him. And then Johan didn't play him. And you think, wow, it just seems incredible that someone like Michael Laudrup wouldn't play in a European Cup final for Barcelona. But, you know, it seems a bit odd. So I'm going to go through the lineup. So we've got Milan, had Rossi, Tassotti, Panucci, Albertini, and Gali and Maldini. Donadoni, Desai, Boban, Savicevic, and Massaro. So if you're not familiar, Panucci filled in at left back. Tassotti was at right back as captain. You had Gali and Maldini in the centre-back spots. Albertini and Desai were the 2 centre midfielders. Albertini was an incredible footballer to watch. So smooth on the ball, brilliant passing range. Always wore a number 4 as well, which I think is just perfect for a sort of central midfield general. Desai was sort of the enforcer, if you like, but his determination, his drive, his power, his tackling ability actually was superb. He was in there as well. Out wide, you've got the flair, creativity of Boban and Donadoni, and Savicevic and Massaro up front, who you could probably argue were not sort of a 9 and a 10. Savicevic was like a 10. Massaro was kind of he wasn't quite a 9, but he wasn't quite a 10. He was a bit of a 7 and 11. He kind of blended across that sort of front line. I do wonder if it was modern football, he would be one of those inverted wingers, cutting inside on his stronger foot. You look at Barca's side, you've got Zubizarreta, Ferrer, Guardiola, Koeman, Nadal, Baquero, Sergi, Stoichkov, Amor, Romario, and Begaristan. So their side set up, it was kind of 4 at the back that became a 3 at the back, and Guardiola would sort of float in between the centre-backs to pick up the ball, and Moore and Baquero were sort of box-to-box, but creative players, and it was very similar to how Barcelona would play after this point as well. But, Phil, the box office was Barcelona's Stoichkov and Romario, 2 absolute mavericks who were just fantastic footballers, weren't they?
Absolutely superb, mate. Yeah, and I mean the goal quantity that they provided to that Barcelona team that season, I think they scored over 50 of their goals that season between the two of them. So they're absolutely immense. And of course, both of them went on to feature in the World Cup, and they were huge stars of that World Cup as well. So yeah, real box office. And Barcelona were huge favourites to win this final. As a matter of fact, I don't think, I mean, if you were to go to a betting shop around that time and say that you were going to put money on Milan winning, never mind winning by the scoreline that they did, you would have been laughed out of the betting shop, because Barca was such overriding favourites for that final.
Yeah, and I think the form plays into it. They haven't really got that many players missing. Obviously, Laudrup missed out through selection, because obviously we had Koeman, Stoichkov, Romario all starting, which meant Laudrup couldn't start. Alex, it kind of feels, I mean, it is pretty much a clash of the Titans, but a clash of 2 very different Titans in the way that they were built. I mean, if you watch, you know, if anyone out there wants to actually watch the game, the full game is out there on YouTube. You may have to use some translated subtitles to actually view it. But it's 2 quite different styles of football, isn't it, that actually match up in the final?
Yeah, very, very defensively solid. There's a lot of counter attacks early on from Milan, whereas you got that kind of Cruyffian approach to kind of open passing game. Obviously, like destructive capabilities of Stoichkov and Romario. So yeah, kind of flair and excitement against organization and real physicality with that little bit of flair from Savicevic and Boban thrown in, and very difficult. As well. You think Barcelona a lot of let's say characters up front, Stoichkov and Romario, two very famously combustible characters, but Cruyff, with his kind of wisdom and charisma, is able to hold the whole thing together, at least for a certain period before it explodes.
Without meaning to pigeonhole you as the kit guy, Alex, the kits are pretty incredible in this, aren't they? I mean, I have got all of the Champions League winning teams shirts from 92, 93 onwards, and I do own that 93, 94 Milan shirt, which took a lot of money and searching to actually get. But it's quite traditional, isn't it, for Milan? People may be wondering why they're not in their sort of traditional away shirt, but they always generally would wear white, wouldn't they, as the sort of European colours, especially because they were the home team in this one. And then Barca had a special European kit, so it's not just a modern thing where teams are wearing different shirts, is it? It was kind of some teams were doing that even at this period.
Yeah, and they've moved on from Maber, and you got this Kappa that would kind of, would clothe them throughout this really successful period in the 1990s. But you say European kits. Also, this is the last time we don't have sponsors as well. Barcelona wouldn't do, but Milan also having to take Motta out as well. So very kind of like old feel to it. Two quite simple designs and as you say, traditional colours, and almost like it could be in the 70s or 80s in terms of the kit at least.
Yeah, definitely. So that's kind of the preamble. We know where we've come from. We've seen these two amazing teams. We know what the teams look like. Phil, the first sort of 20 minutes, half an hour is quite balanced, isn't it, in the game? I know we do get an early goal from Massaro within that period of time, but both teams, I'm not going to say they weren't defensive, but they really felt each other out in that first sort of 20, 30 minutes, didn't they? But there was chances for both, and it looked like we were, straight away in for a really good final.
It did, and but I mean, Barcelona's chances came early. I think Romario screwed one wide across the face of the goal. But after that, you could see that AC Milan were starving their kind of front two of the ball. They didn't see much of the ball, and then of course there came the Massaro goal, which culminated from a huge kind of punt up front by Sebastiano Rossi, and then I think Savicevic nicks the ball away from the right fullback and goes on a run into the box and puts the ball across the face of the goal. Massaro makes it 1-0, and then after that, after it being quite a tight game, I think that was about the 20th minute, something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
After that, Milan assumed total control. After that, it's really kind of like and somehow Barcelona kind of stagger towards the halftime whistle, and if they would have gone into the break at 1-0 down, it probably would have been an injustice to Milan, because Milan were that much on top that it should have been more than 1-0, but they didn't get to halftime. It was the second goal that killed them, and it was the magic of my favourite Roberto Donadoni that set it up again for Massaro, and 2-0 at half time. I mean, it was thoroughly deserved. The first half they were outstanding, especially for the last 25 minutes, and they were 2-0 up, and but there was still that suspicion that they might get back into it, Barcelona.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of moments, isn't there, when you watch the highlights and you see Capello on the bench, and it's the classic time where they're not in Formula One seats or rally car seats or whatever. They're kind of sitting around the side of the pitch with, club suits, by the way. You should be able to buy club suits in shops, because the way they look, especially the Italians. Cruyff was always quite a bit of a maverick with his trench coat, wasn't he, in his fag in his hand. But Capello and his sort of compatriots from Milan, they do look a little bit like they can't believe what's actually going on. Like, the plan has worked. The defensively are so solid. Barcelona cannot get through. I think Romario gets through at one point. I think it's after the first goal, and it takes a deflection off the Milan defender and goes wide.
Yeah.
But really, there's not a lot there for Barcelona to feed off. And that second goal is, I mean, Donadoni's run down the line. He's aggressive. He's powerful. And the cutback and the finish from Massaro past Zubizarreta, who, you know, for all intents and purposes, looks very, very ordinary in this game compared to, you know, the standard that he had in football. Going into the second half, they're 2-0 up. They're cruising. Someone you mentioned earlier on, Alex Savicevic, takes over and creates a goal in a moment that you kind of hope that you're getting a final. You know, sometimes you get these incredible finals. You know, your team have been in a couple of them where you get an incredible moment or an incredible goal from a player that will always make the final memorable. This is obviously memorable for an incredible Milan performance. Talk us through that Savicevic goal to put them 3-0 up.
Well, that's it. To start with the negative side, I mean, the three of these goals, the three of the four, I mean, the one you described before half-time, beautiful kind of flowing move and wing play and so on. But the other three really kind of come from bobbles, from mistakes, from little defensive errors and so on. And perhaps maybe explain why there's such a huge gulf in the team. But yeah, Nadal, bit of indecision out on the left in the plane, moved out to the left back position and doesn't really know what he's doing, gets caught in four minds. And Savicevic picks his pocket, and then, of course, what do? You're at a narrow angle, you're 30 yards out. So, of course, you try and lob the keeper, who is well positioned, not really off his line, and you just dinks it into the very far corner. Look, not many footballers would have thought to do that.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because it's bobbling around and you kind of think he'd try and trap it, get it under control, maybe get a little bit closer to goal. But I suppose when you 2-0 up, the confidence must have been so high in the dressing room at half time. You think, do you know what? I'm going to make a name for myself here. I'm just going to find the back of the net. And Savicevic, Phil, he was from that crop of quite incredible group of players from the Yugoslavia at the back end of the 80s, and he had his moment, didn't he?
He certainly did, and what I like to, I mean, we say Zubizarreta didn't look at his best, but there was a total unsavability about that as well.
Yeah.
You know,
maybe I'm being a bit harsh.
Yeah, it was audacious, but it was also like you'd expect to keep it, but there was no way he was ever getting near it. It was an incredible, sublime piece of skill in like the biggest club competition in the world, probably.
Yeah, and for all Cruyff's talk before the game of, you know, we're going to demolish Milan, it's going to be a one-sided game. Desai decided that he was going to power through the whole of the centre of Barcelona's team, Phil, and find the back of the net with, quite frankly, an absolutely brilliant finish. And like you were saying before, Alex, we might have thought of him as a big, tall, stoic defender, the heart of Chelsea's defence in the late 90s. But Phil, at that moment, he certainly was not that, was he?
He wasn't. It was like, for me, it was like the Tony Adams moment in 1998 when he waltzes through the middle of the Everton defence and smashes one in, and you're like, where did that come from? And it was the same with Desai. Just an interesting thing. This is one that I've run by you, and it might be an interesting one for our listeners to kind of ponder. There were 3 World Cup winners on that pitch, but only one of them was Italian. Does anybody out there know who that is? It's quite a toughie because I ran it by you guys, didn't I? It's quite a tough one.
Yeah, so, it's a tough question, that, Phil. I wonder if we can get any listeners to reply underneath the podcast notes or on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it these days, and see if you can answer that question from Phil.
Let us know, guys. Let us know. If anybody the first person who gets it right, I might pop a little kind of present in the post to you. So there's that incentive as well.
Well, there you go. I have to log into one of my other accounts, Phil, to see if I can try and get a little freebie.
But you already know the answer, don't you?
Oh, well, you won't know it's me. Right. So, I mean, what do you do? What do you do at 58 minutes when Marcel Desailly just ripped your defence into bits and curled an absolutely unbelievable finish? You've got, 30 minutes to go? Cruyff's Barcelona, is this is this the moment, Alex, where it all starts to fall apart and maybe things aren't quite right as often they can be at the Camp Nou?
Well, what they did start doing was kicking people. So in the grand tradition of like one-sided games, the referee seemed to, for the highlights of just given up on the concept of giving out cards. I think could quite easily have been maybe 3 or 4 red cards for ropey tackles. Yeah, when a couple of Milan players sort of transgressed slightly, it was whipped straight out. So I think that was it. It's all over. It's done and dusted. Bit of frustration, a few hot-headed characters around there. So it is a real surprise that it did still end at 11 against 11.
Yeah, I think when you look down the list of the players who got yellow cards, there's so many defenders who ended up with bookings. You know, even Panucci getting booked so late in the game, 88 minutes he gets booked. And I think those fouls certainly did show the kind of mentality that Barcelona could have had maybe if things weren't quite going the way. I think, Alex, you'd said before about Cruyff was the one who, I mean, possibly could have been like that at times within his own playing career, Johan Cruyff. But he sort of held that team together, and they'd sort of been pulled apart a little bit, hadn't they, Phil, by Capello, by Milan. And really, it's quite an embarrassing defeat in the end, isn't it? Because Milan played unbelievably well, but the game was done after 58 minutes.
That's it. I think, and we saw a very regressive Barcelona. It was like Barcelona from 10 years previous, where they did used to kind of kick their way to victory. But I mean, as a kind of epitaph to the game, it also signalled the end for both teams domestically. Really, I know Milan went on to reach the final the next year, which we'll talk about in the next one. But they were nowhere in the league next year, Milan, and neither were Barcelona. So it had its own kind of, there was a kind of sour kind of filtrate that kind of ran through from that game for both sides. But of course, it was a fantastic game on the evening, and but it was the end really of an era for both of them.
Yeah, and Cruyff does sort of labour on a bit longer. He ends up leaving, I think, 95, 96, doesn't he? I think they'd finished trophyless in his final season. I mean, if we're counting the Supercopa de España as a trophy, I think maybe that's debatable. But if you're just going on pure numbers, that 95, 96 season was the first time they hadn't won a trophy since the 86, 87 season. So when you look at it, their run had been absolutely incredible, but it had come to an end. Milan, on the other hand, they pick up a couple of Serie A titles in the 90s. Very, very odd side, Milan, in the 90s. And I do remember this was the first ever Champions League final that I'd watched. And we were going on holiday the next day, so we were all sort of up late packing our bags for, the classic 2 weeks in Mallorca that you had in the mid-90s. And I remember this Milan side being incredible. But as I was, picking up on Serie A, watching Gazzetta Football Italia, getting more and more into football, if you look at Milan, after this season, they finish 4th. They win the European Super Cup, the Supercoppa Italiana. Their team's sort of a little bit in transition. They end up getting George Weah to replace Van Basten. They win the league in 96. Then they finish 11th and 10th. And then win the title again. I think Zaccaroni comes over from Udinese, brings Bierhoff with him, and they win another title. And then again, not a lot, but they do win a Champions League. So I suppose Milan have been very, very patchy after that. And I know Cruyff, maybe it didn't end well, but you had Van Gaal, then Rijkaard, then Guardiola, then Luis Enrique, who all kind of built a Barcelona side of their own with Champions League glory, the Liga glory. So I suppose long-term, thinking about the legacy, I suppose, Alex, we have to say Barcelona, despite getting beat 4-0 in quite an embarrassing fashion, over the last 30 years, they probably thanks to Johan Cruyff's foundations, have they become, I mean, you could argue with Real Madrid, couldn't you? The premier sort of European force?
Yeah, I think so. And it's just a meeting of styles going in and out of fashion, isn't it? The Catenaccio ultra defensive style. I think probably, is it 98 96, you probably had that in Italy, that sort of adherence into this sort of rotating of the number 10s, and then 2000, 2002, you start to move away from that, whereas it's just coming into fashion, this Barcelona approach. And you say there's so many disciples now sort of all across Europe, and it's just a kind of a way of playing, isn't it? And that formation even is probably the dominant formation, whereas 4-4-2 was probably, and 3-5-2, the one at the time, the idea of kind of playing one up front. So yeah, and Milan just are not helped by absolutely hideous recruitment, and I suppose Barcelona the same. But you look, it's again, it's a Manchester United fan. It's a period to almost sort of rival that. I mean, some of the signings just didn't work. Looking through the next couple of seasons, you've got Christophe Dugarry arriving for big money, Jesper Blomqvist, obviously with injuries, Baggio, who's in that period, where he can't do anything right until he goes to Bologna. You got Ibrahim Bar arriving, 12 million euro. Didn't really work for Leonardo, Ziga, Andreas Anderson. Yeah, it's until you get towards sort of 2000, it's just a miserable period of recruitment, and the likes of Costa Curta, Baresi retiring, Desai getting older as well, Van Basten obviously losing some really key figures and replacing them with players who probably aren't up to supporting that mantle.
I suppose if we get all philosophical about it, Barcelona built a culture at a club, whereas Milan built super teams with their super players and hoarded talent, I suppose. And most teams now are trying to do both, I suppose. And one thing I love about Barcelona's set of managers is Cruyff hated Van Gaal. Rijkaard obviously had been so successful at Milan, and then obviously Pep takes over as well, and then Luis Enrique as well. So it's kind of that nice little flow through Barcelona, isn't it, Phil? But what are your sort of lasting memories, Phil, of this one? Thinking about legacy of the two teams.
Well, I just think of the Ronald Koeman goals, like the absolute bullets from outside the box. Obviously, the final itself was just it was watched in a kind of haze of disbelief by me, because I was one of the many who believed that Barcelona were going to win. And it was so unlike Milan's performances of the season. It was expressive and full of kind of flair and excitement. So it was an untypical performance from the Milan of that season. So I remember that. I remember it being a great final, an incredibly one-sided one at that. But Milan at the very, very top of their game.
Yeah, and it's great to see that, isn't it? I mean, obviously, finals are great when both teams are firing on all cylinders, but I think a final like this sticks in the memory through such an incredible performance by Milan. And Barcelona will probably rue this moment. They've taken so long to win it. They won it in 92. They came back again. I mean, we have had Milan in the previous episode. We've had Milan in this episode. We're going to have Milan again in the next episode. And there's a little bit of 90s that I like about, the run of Champions League finals, where we get a lot of repeated teams coming again. We get Milan, we get Ajax, we get Juventus, kind of feeding into all of that. So quite a great period for the Champions League. Next up, we have got the 94-95 final, which is a brilliant final, great competition, two fantastic teams to talk about in the final. But Phil and Alex, really enjoyed chatting about the 93-94 Champions League season. And the final. So, Alex, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Phil, thanks for letting us take over your podcast and talk a little bit about the Champions League.
Mate, it gives me a break. Thank you. No, and it's always fantastic fun talking with you guys. So thank you. It's been great.
And thanks everyone for listening. Obviously, follow the content on Fuzzball Geeks. All the relevant links are there as always. Do let us know what you think about the podcast. If we're missing anything, we obviously don't just want to describe the goals and describe the football, but we try and give a bit of a balance between how our finalists have got to the end. But like I say, follow Fuzzball Geeks, subscribe on YouTube, and share the podcast with your friends and all that sort of stuff that you have to do these days to get us listeners. But from the final and the three of us, thanks a lot.